Public comment is an incredibly powerful tool if you're willing to embrace it and use it to its fullest extent.
The Fargo City Commission voted unanimously this week to approve a new format when it comes to public comment at commission meetings. This all comes after months of packed city commission chambers with people urging the city to issue an official ceasefire resolution about the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Valley News Team's Bobby Fallon joins us now with details. Bobby.
Justin, the commission says the new guidelines are to ensure that public input is productive and that special interest groups are not allowed to dominate the proceedings before the vote. A representative of the ACLU of North Dakota talked about the importance of public comment in city governance.
Embracing public comment promotes the First Amendment rights of citizens while encouraging the transparency, accountability, public participation that is all central to a government of, by, and for the people of Fargo.
Now, so here are the changes. Residents or business owners may address topics on the agenda during that section of the meeting after the staff presentation. A limit of 12 people will be allowed to sign up for an agenda item. General public comments, which are not about an agenda item, will now happen at the end of the meeting instead of at the beginning. Now, City Commission meetings will be using this new format starting at the next City Commission meeting. However, that does not mean it couldn't change again in the future.
An annual review of these as a commission. This was our first stab at putting this together, but we have to your point, Commissioner Preston, make sure that they're doing what we intended them to do.
Now, anyone from the public who wants to sign up to speak at a City Commission meeting can do so at the City Commission office or online. They must sign up by noon on the day of a regularly scheduled meeting.
All right, thanks, Bobby. We have all those details posted on valleynewslive.com and the free VNL News app.